She was a mother of 4. She cooked dinner, folded laundry, paid rent, argued with her kids, kissed them goodnight, and likely told them the same thing every tired parent does. "I'll see you tomorrow." But tomorrow never came. Lula Cora Hood vanished in 1970 from Galesburg, Illinois, and the terrifying part: no one really noticed at first. There was no dramatic manhunt, no wall-to-wall news coverage, no weeping press conference. She was simply gone. A woman already living on the margins, black, middle-aged, a single mother, with a hard life and few resources. It was almost like the world silently agreed. She wasn't important enough to keep looking for, but her children disagreed, especially her daughter, Brenda. For years, Brenda would wake up in the middle of the night, convinced she had heard her mother's voice outside the window. There were no clues, no sightings, just that lingering, aching doubt. Did she walk away from us? Or did someone take her away? Decades passed, and Galesburg moved on. The people who knew Lula grew older, their memories of her fading into old photos and holiday stories no one told anymore. Meanwhile, Lula's case went cold, so cold, in fact, that by the time a skeleton was found in a brickyard in 1996, local authorities didn't hesitate to assume it was her. Female remains, found near where Lula had last been seen. The mystery seemed solved. The community accepted it. No questions asked. The family buried the idea of her. Not the body, just the concept of closure. They believed she was dead. They mourned her. They marked her birthday with quiet prayers, even though no grave bore her name. But Lula wasn't in that brickyard. She was alive, living in a different state, under a different name. And she hadn't been kidnapped. She had walked away. And when her story finally surfaced, more than 3 decades later, it tore everything apart. Because what her children learned wasn't just that their mother was alive, it was that she had chosen silence over reunion, distance over healing, escape over family. And that's where the real story begins. The question isn't why she disappeared. The real question is, why did she never come back? When the bones were found in 1996, no one wanted to admit it out loud, but there was almost a kind of relief, a twisted, exhausted sense of closure. For Lula's family, pain had become normal. The open wound of not knowing had scarred over into a dull, permanent ache. And so, when the local authorities said, "We believe this is her," the family didn't fight it. They held back their questions. They swallowed their disbelief. It was easier that way. The truth, however, has a tendency to wait in the dark. It wouldn't be until 2008, 38 years after Lula Cora Hood disappeared, that the illusion began to crack. A routine cold case review by the Illinois State Police quietly reopened the file. Technological advancements in DNA testing had opened doors that hadn't existed in the 90s. New analysts were cross-referencing missing persons with unidentified remains nationwide. One of them ran a comparison between Lula's children and the bones buried under her name. The match didn't fit. The remains weren't hers. That brickyard skeleton, it was someone else entirely, unnamed, still unidentified to this day. For the Hood family, the grief they had come to live with turned into something worse. Betrayal by the very hope they had accepted. They hadn't buried their mother. They had buried a stranger. That realization hit like a second loss. Raw, brutal, sudden. For Brenda and her siblings, it meant reopening every wound, re-asking every question, and reawakening every possible nightmare that had haunted them since 1970. But the biggest nightmare hadn't even started yet. As DNA ruled out the skeleton, investigators did something that Lula's family hadn't dared to try in decades. They started looking for her again, this time as though she might still be alive. And then the impossible happened. They found her, alive, living under her maiden name, in a different state. And she wasn't hiding in fear. She wasn't being held against her will. There was no basement, no captor, no crime scene. There was just a quiet woman in her 70s, living alone, surviving in the shadows of America, untraced, unclaimed, and seemingly unremorseful. When the police knocked on her door, she didn't panic. She didn't beg for help. She didn't cry. She didn't even look surprised. She simply said, "Yes, I'm Lula." The investigation had just turned inside out. The missing woman hadn't been missing. She had simply left, disconnected, disappeared by choice. And for the Hood family, that was the real shock. She could have come back, but she never did. There's a specific kind of pain that can't be labeled by the justice system. It isn't murder. It isn't assault. It's not even abandonment in a legal sense, but it feels like all three. That's the pain Lula Cora Hood's family had to reckon with when they found out she had been alive all along. Not imprisoned, not incapacitated, not coerced, just gone. Brenda Hood was already a middle-aged woman by the time she heard the words that shattered her foundation. "We found her." Those words should have brought healing. Instead, they detonated decades of internalized guilt, imagined crimes, half-finished prayers, and false memories. Her mother, who she once feared had been murdered, had simply stopped calling. No one in the family had ever truly asked the question, what if she chose to leave? Because to ask it would mean confronting the unbearable idea that they weren't enough to make her stay. And now, that nightmare was real. There were no ransom notes to explain away the silence, no diagnosed illness to soften the confusion. Lula had been fully capable of returning. She had just decided not to. When asked why she left, she gave no long story, no drama, no tears. She said it like she was talking about an old job she quit without notice. She had needed space. She had felt overwhelmed. She wanted peace. That was it. But to the children left behind, those words weren't peace. They were psychological warfare. Her absence hadn't just marked their birthdays and holidays, it had left scars across generations. There were kids in the family who had grown up with the myth of Lula Cora Hood, the poor mother taken too soon, only to find out she had been watching the world spin from a distance, invisible by design. The betrayal wasn't loud or violent. It came in slow waves, old yearbooks revisited, wondering if she ever thought to open one. Baby pictures scrutinized again, questioning if she had saved any. The worst kind of grief, the kind that asks, what if I meant nothing? Reporters caught wind of the story, and while it never became a national media frenzy, it did catch local attention. A woman declared dead, now alive. A skeleton misidentified. A family robbed of truth, not by evil, but by erasure. The irony was brutal. Lula had vanished, but it wasn't some monster who took her. She had erased herself. The public wanted answers, but Lula didn't want the spotlight. She refused all interviews. She issued no statement. She declined to attend any family reunions or funerals for relatives who had passed while searching for her. She didn't apologize, and somehow that silence said more than any confession ever could. Brenda struggled the most. She tried to make peace with the idea that her mother had suffered in ways she could never understand. Maybe things had happened that Lula never spoke of. Trauma, perhaps. Abuse, maybe. But even then, she couldn't shake one question. Why didn't she tell us? When you lose someone to death, you mourn. When you lose someone to choice, you question everything about yourself. That's what made Lula's reappearance not a miracle, but a second disappearance. The mother who was found had no intention of being found in the way they'd hoped. She had left the room decades ago, and when they opened the door again, she was still already gone. Some disappearances are solved with a body, others with a confession. But what happens when the only thing left to recover is choice? When Lula Cora Hood was finally located alive after more than 2 decades of absence, the world expected closure. The kind you see in movies: tears, embraces, a return to the life that once was. But that version never played out, because closure assumes both sides are still looking for the same door. In Lula's case, she had locked hers long ago and thrown away the key. The story didn't end in a courtroom or a gravesite. It ended in a quiet apartment miles from her past, surrounded by walls that hadn't heard a single birthday wish in 23 years. For the Hood family, the final chapter wasn't finding her. It was accepting that she had never planned to come back. Investigators closed the case. The public moved on. But for Brenda and her siblings, there was no case file thick enough to explain away the vacuum Lula left behind. They had lived through the worst-case scenario, and then lived through something even stranger, being told their tragedy wasn't a tragedy at all. What they had mourned for decades wasn't death, but detachment. And detachment doesn't make headlines. After Lula's discovery, media outlets reached out with offers for interviews, documentaries, exposés. She rejected them all. She had no interest in reliving the past, no need to explain, and no desire to rebuild any bridge she had burned. This wasn't a woman in hiding. This was a woman who had outgrown her origin story and discarded it like a coat from another season. The world debated her motives. Was she mentally ill? Was she fleeing something? Or did she just want out? Psychologists were consulted by reporters. They threw around terms like dissociative fugue, trauma-induced amnesia, and emotional self-preservation. But Lula never offered medical records, never spoke of trauma. In fact, she barely spoke of anything. She had simply reinvented herself in a new city and never looked back. Her disappearance had once left a dent in her family's history. Her return didn't repair it, it deepened it. Cousins who never met her now whispered her name like a campfire ghost story. Younger relatives didn't know whether to be relieved she was alive or furious she had let everyone believe she wasn't. Family photos remained on mantles, except hers. She had become a living ghost. And perhaps most tragically of all, no one really knew why. No diary was found, no secret abuse uncovered, no dramatic reveal, just silence. Not the kind that screams, but the kind that suffocates. She had gone missing in 1970. Her family declared her legally dead in the 90s, and yet she had outlived that version of herself by decades. When she was found, there was no ceremony, no reunion, no tearful televised moment. Just a quiet knock on a door, and a woman saying, "Yes, that's me," like she was confirming a dinner reservation. That moment, simple, sterile, hollow, was the end of the case. But for the rest of us, Lula Cora Hood's story doesn't end with her being found. It ends with a question. Can you mourn someone who's still breathing? And even more haunting, what if the person you miss never missed you back? Some cases teach us about justice, some about resilience. This one? It teaches us that sometimes the most painful mysteries aren't solved by answers. They're created by them. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. Would you forgive someone who left like this? Or would you search forever for a reason? Like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more true stories that challenge what we think we know and how far we're willing to go for the truth. Got a case we should cover? Drop it below. You might see it in our next deep dive.